My next guest is Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large with The Australian, as we grapple with another government issue perhaps that's sold. If you see a reaction to religious discrimination, the changes, the latest amendments announced today. He joins me now from our Sky News Centre. Paul Kelly, thanks very much for your time. Some amendments announced today, 11 in total. Initial reaction from religious groups, they seem to be pleased. Has the government landed something here, do you think?
Well, I think there are signs of optimism about this as far as the government's concerned. I guess the point to make here, Tom, is that the Prime Minister is determined to proceed with this legislation. This was a commitment he's made. The government's been working on this ever since the Ruddock report some time ago. The Attorney-General has had enormous consultations on this. He's committed to proceeding with this legislation, and it's complicated legislation which involves finding compromise outcomes between competing interests and competing principles, and this is always difficult. But I think the government will take more heart from where things are at the moment.
Because it was looking pretty troublesome there for a while. They managed to get something that upset groups on the one side who were worried about, rights being impinged, religious groups as well. Speaking today, Christian Porter said that actually once he got down to the nub of it, for example, around what employers could do and so on, that both sides were okay once this was explained a bit better. Do you sense this will be something without sort of any backlash now? It'll finally go away?
Oh, I think there'll be some backlash. I mean, there's clearly going to be differences about this. This will be a contentious issue. But if the government can get to the stage where it's got a tolerable degree of support for this inside its own party room, and so it can then go ahead and proceed with the legislation, this raises an issue then for the Labor Party. Where does Labor stand on this? What would Labor do with such legislation? So this will all be played out in the new year, but this is important legislation. We know for a fact that there is insufficient legislative protection for religion in this country. This has been documented at length by parliamentary committees. It's been conceded by political experts, by legal experts on the left and right. So the argument for such legislation is strong, and it will come down to a further test in the Parliament next year.
We'll see what Labor does do. They do have some of their own MPs concerned about this as well. What is your opinion, Paul, on the optics? Well, I guess from both leaders, you've got Anthony Albanese getting out on the front foot about coal exports this week, and today Scott Morrison on religious discrimination, as the bushfires are having such a big impact on their city, and of course you've got the volcano eruption as well. Is there an optics issue, or do you have to just get on with government?
Oh, well, you've got to get on with government, and you've got to also address the optics. I'd make 2 points about what Anthony Albanese's done. So essentially he's attempting to reposition the Labor Party here, saying we support coal industry exports, but we will focus on domestic emissions reduction and have ambitious targets. So the first thing this means is there's now a pretty open and intense political war between Labor and the Greens. And everyone in the Labor caucus, whether they like it or not, if this position remains, will be enlisted as conscripts in this war against the Greens. The Greens see a great opportunity here for Labor. Labor are supporting coal exports, so the Greens will go in very, very hard with a major attack on the Labor Party. So we'll have a pretty significant fracture on the centre-left of politics here. The second point to make is Albanese standing as a conviction politician. Now, essentially what he's doing now is come in as an established left-winger. This is what he is, this is his essence, and his task is to reposition Labor towards the centre. And he'll have to do this on a range of issues. This is one. Well, how credible is it for Albanese as a conviction politician to now say, hey, I'm a champion of coal exports. Will people believe that, or will people be cynical? Imagine what Scott Morrison's attack will be. Morrison's attack will be, well, you can't believe him. He's saying one thing before the election, he's now posing as a champion of the coal export sector. Well, you can't believe this guy. So I think we're going to see an interesting issue emerging about Anthony Albanese into the future about, okay, he's now a pragmatist. What does he stand for? Is he believable?
And can he fight that war on two fronts you just spoke about? Finally, I wanted to ask you about, well, there'll be an interesting trip for Scott Morrison in January to India. It's increasingly being spoken about as this pivot country. It's been long the hope of Australia that they'd have really close ties with India. It's an economic hedge to China. Is it something that could become more of a reality despite the protectionist bent within the Indian economy?
There's no doubt that relations with India are flourishing and developing in a way they haven't before. And this is really based on the strength of the Indian economy and that strength continuing, and there are question marks about that. And it's also based on a much stronger trading and resources relationship between Australia and India. If we have a build-up and a strengthening in the economic partnership, and that's happening, then that changes a relationship. It changes a bilateral relationship. It gives it much more purpose and meaning and ballast. And that's what's happening with India. It's wrong to think that India is going to be some substitute for Australia for China. That's just nonsense. And India is not a China. It won't be a China. It won't develop the way China did. But there are a lot of gains to be made in the relationship with India, economic and strategic. And Morrison is interested in both. The strategic sense that he's attempting to build up, and this was made clear in the Lowy lecture he gave several weeks ago, is he is wishing to develop a balancing sense in Asia. He's putting a lot of work into relations with Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, India and Vietnam. A lot of work in that. And essentially what this is all about is it's developing beneficial bilateral relations with those countries, and many of those relations of course are of a very long-standing nature. But it's also working in terms of regional cooperation and strategic coordination vis-a-vis China. That's clearly the Morrison game plan.
It does make it an interesting trip to India, which happens when maybe not everyone's tuning in, but we will be. Paul Kelly, thank you.